Today we're going to begin learning about film editing. We'll be talking about what a film editor does, what we mean by the term editing when it comes to filmmaking, and what contribution a film editor makes to the way a story is told in a film. We'll also be learning a little bit about the beginnings of film editing, because those early moments in film history are incredibly important. In this video, we're going to be covering these three vocabulary terms. There are many more to come in Lesson 9, but these are the three we'll be talking about right now. We'll learn about the cut, which is kind of the most basic term when it comes to film editing. We're going to be learning about closure, and then its related term, at least within film, is the Kuleshov effect. The word editing is something that it's a familiar word to us. We hear it often. At least it's a common word. Typically, when we use the word editing, we mean to make corrections, like edit your essay, edit this project, or this art piece or something like that, right? We typically mean look it over and figure out what kind of corrections we need to make. When it comes to film, film production, it actually has a different meaning. It doesn't mean correcting, and it actually doesn't mean removing things. Film editing actually is more of a process of assembly, of putting together, okay, of adding shots to other shots. Okay, so a simple definition of film editing would be the art, technique, and practice of assembling shots into a coherent sequence. Okay. Editing is part of what's called the post-production process. So the film goes through three basic stages. There's pre-production, which is writing the script, assembling the cast, you have auditions and things like that. The cast comes together and they do read-throughs, they learn their lines, etc., etc. There's also the cinematographer begins to storyboard, and they think about how they're going to shoot these different scenes. And so there's a lot of things going into the pre-production. Then there's the production process, which is actually the filming, the shooting. And then there's post-production, where those shots all get edited together. They get pieced together. We have a number of other things that take place in the post-production process as well. But the shooting is really gathering the raw materials. All those different scenes are shot in different ways, and then it's all comes down to the editor to figure out what's the best way to assemble those. Okay, and this is something I'll talk about in just a bit. But even though that we're only spending probably a week on editing, we spend a lot more on cinematography. Editing is just as important as cinematography when it comes to visual storytelling. And in some ways, editing is actually more important to narrative storytelling in film than cinematography, because it really is what makes film unique. Okay? I'll talk more about that in just a bit. Film editing is both a creative and technical endeavor. Cinematography is too. There's a lot of technical jargon, a lot of technical skill that goes into cinematography, but it's also very creative, for reasons that I'm sure you understand, having gone through all of our lessons on cinematography. Editing too is also creative. It's not just sitting in front of a computer and knowing how to use those editing programs. It's also creative in the sense that the film editor, working with the director and so forth, they are the ones responsible for what we see on that screen in terms of how one shot comes after another shot and so forth. Okay, so if a cinematographer's job is to make those shots look good, then the editor's job is to make the entire film look good by knowing how and when to put those shots together in a sequence, and knowing how to sequence them and so forth. So that's really the point of this unit on editing is to try to understand better how an editor helps to tell the story. When they take those shots from the cinematographer, how do they know which transitions to use? How do they know, how do they decide how long a shot should be, when to cut it, and when to start the next shot, and so forth. I want to present to you an analogy. Okay, so the analogy is a film is like a story. And in a way it is. I mean, a film tells a story. Many films do. They don't all tell stories, but most of the time film tells a story. Okay, if a film is a story, then what's the most basic element of a story? If you had to boil a story down to kind of the smallest unit, what would it be? Well, arguably, you could say that it's words. And in the world of film, the most basic unit, the smallest unit of a film would be the shots. We talked about this weeks ago. Okay, so the smallest unit of a film is the shot, and the smallest unit of a story is words. Well, if the shots are words, then the scenes in a movie would be equivalent to sentences in a story. Because a scene is composed of several different shots put together. Okay? What holds our sentences together? It's kind of a confusing question, perhaps, but when I speak to you through these videos, or when I write to you in instructions or emails or announcements on Classroom, and I use sentences, how do those sentences make sense? What do I rely on to make sure that my sentences make sense when I communicate them to you? You may not know this, but there is a word for this. It's called syntax. And I think it's actually where we get the word sentence from. You can kind of see it there in the S, and the N, and so forth. Syntax is like the logical glue that binds our sentences together. And it's essentially the set of rules or the guidelines that dictate how our words should be put together in order to form a coherent expression. And syntax will change depending on the region and the language. Okay, and so it is, like I said, the logical glue that holds our words together and allows me to communicate to you in a sentence and in a way that you will understand. Okay, because we kind of rely on the same syntax. Well, in our analogy here, we could think of editing as that syntax. It is the set of rules or logical principles that dictate how shots are put together to form a coherent story, to move that story forward. Okay. Now, I realize this is kind of abstract right now, but hopefully over the course of the next several minutes, we'll come to better understand what we mean by that. So we'll revisit that in just a little bit. Okay, let's take a quick look at what editing was back in the early days of editing, the advent of film editing, back when film was only celluloid. Okay, in fact, the word film used to mean. One of the meanings of film was the actual film itself, the film stock, okay, the celluloid strips that you can see here that projectors shine lights through to make the images appear on the screen. Editors would have to literally cut. This is a tiny example of this. They would have to look through all of these rolls of celluloid at each frame and so forth, and they would physically have to cut the strip of film and then splice it together with another strip of film to move on to the next shot. Okay, and that was kind of the technical aspect of what editors had to do. Nowadays, of course, most film editors are going to be looking like this. Editing is done largely digitally, and so there is a whole different world of technical knowledge that a film editor has to have. But again, the basic work is still the same. They're assembling. Okay, they're figuring out where to cut a shot and when to put it together with another shot, and how to work sound into that as well. We'll talk about sound next week. Okay. Editing didn't always exist in the world of cinema. Early films, one of the first films that were shot and shown to people in theaters, weren't actually edited. In fact, they didn't tell stories. They were really like animated pictures, animated photographs. Okay, the Lumiere brothers made some of these earliest animated photographs. And basically what they would just park a camera somewhere and they were like glimpses into everyday life. Okay, so I think this one's called Workers Exiting a Factory. And as you can see, there's really no editing here. Okay, the camera is positioned in front of this factory, they begin rolling, the people pour out of it, and that is it. And that is all it is. Editing, the story goes that film editing was kind of discovered by accident by this guy, George Méliès. And I don't know how much truth there is to this story, or how true it is that the world of editing was discovered by accident, but it's a good story. Méliès was a French filmmaker, but he was also an illusionist, a magician. Okay? And the story goes that Méliès had set up his camera on a street corner and was filming traffic, and as a truck was going by, his camera stopped, it jammed, and then he was figure out how to get it back to get it working again. And as he got it working again, started rolling, obviously the truck had already gone by and another car was passing. And so later when he was looking at the film, what it looked like was the truck disappeared and was replaced almost magically with a new car, because that was the moment when his camera had stopped. Okay? And so according to this really interesting story, that was a light bulb. It was a light bulb moment for Méliès. He realized he could actually use this to do like almost like trick photography. And so Méliès began to essentially cut his film and in the middle of a shot, and then splice it together with film from another shot, but this time the staging would be different. Yeah. So it's almost like stop motion animation or stop motion photography or something like that, right? So this isn't magical. I'll play this again. This isn't computer generated imagery here. This isn't special effects. This is just cutting the film and splicing it together with new film. Okay. But again, this isn't really storytelling. Okay, because this is still the camera's still in one place, and we don't really have much of a narrative here. We just have a magic show. Okay. Now again, you got to understand, when these films came out, when people watched these films, they were blown away. Okay. So for a while, what Méliès was doing was enough to get audiences in their seats, but it wasn't enough to keep them in their seats forever. Okay. What they needed was something more. They needed a story, and so Méliès put this knowledge of editing and these skills of editing to use when he made this film. This was an incredibly influential moment in film history. The Voyage to the Moon. This actually is, I'd say, more like a movie than anything that had come before it, in that it tells a story. Okay. Basically, the story is a group of scientists design a rocket and get in it and go off to they're shot off onto the moon, and then while they're on the moon, they discover an alien race, and there's a fight, and then they retreat back, but one of the aliens stows away and is brought back to Earth, and that's essentially it. So it's kind of, well, you can almost say like an early version of science fiction, but there is kind of a narrative there. There is a conflict. Things happen. The story progresses. Okay, and the way that it progresses was through putting these different scenes together. So here we have the scene in which the scientists board their ship. I'm going to kind of speed this up a little bit. They board their ship, which is shaped like a bullet, and they are placed in what looks like a giant cannon. And speed this up even more. Placed in a giant cannon, like so, and then this is probably going to stop. And then this cannon will shoot them off to the moon, which you see here. So all of what we're seeing here is just a backdrop. This portion right here is staging. It's stagecraft, but all of this would be like a painted backdrop here. What you just saw was editing. Okay. One scene cut to another scene. Now, what's happening here is the camera's still fixed. It's still in one position. They're stopping filming, and then they're changing the stage. Basically, what this is just a theatrical production that's being filmed. So they change the backdrop, they change the set design, and then they change the blocking of the actors. They bring in new actors, they position them in different ways, and so forth. Okay, so it creates the illusion that we are changing a location simply through cutting from one scene to the next. But again, each scene is still one shot. This is what we learned about weeks ago. In early films, early stories like this, each scene was still just one shot. Okay? I'm going to let this go on just a little bit longer. So they're fired off to the moon, and something interesting happens right there. So one of the other things that Méliès kind of invented was the dissolve transition. Okay? He figured out that you could overlap two pieces of film and make it look like one thing was transforming into another. And so we saw that there as the moon, slowly we appeared to get closer, and now we have, of course, the face of the man in the moon. And then there's some editing right there. The bullet, the rocket lands on the moon's eye, and so that was again a little trick that he had discovered there with being able to stop the film and start it with a new piece of film. Now it wasn't until this filmmaker D.W. Griffith that we truly get the kind of editing that we still see today. Okay, the kind of filmmaking that we see today. Again, what Méliès had done and what filmmakers like Edwin S. Porter had done were incredibly influential. Edwin S. Porter was the guy that made The Great Train Robbery, which we saw. But they were still, the stories they were telling were still limited, at least visually, because entire scenes would be comprised by single shots. Okay. But what Griffith had done, he changed all that. And I'm going to show this to you a few times and kind of let you see the example first before we talk about it. This is from his film Birth of a Nation. Incredibly important, influential film, but also very problematic because of the way that it treats race. We're not going to get into that here today, but we're just going to take a look at a brief clip here. So I don't know if you can notice already the differences between a film like this and a film like A Voyage to the Moon. Okay. Right now we're in a single scene. We've got these two brothers sitting on a chair in their yard, reading a note, and one of the brothers here turns and calls to the woman in the doorstep. We are in one scene, but already we have several cuts. Okay? We have this shot here of the two brothers, and we have these shots here This would be kind of a medium or medium long shot of the woman that the brother is calling to. Okay? And just before this, of course, we had the shot of the woman behind the drapes. You could kind of see her trying to get the cat, almost like a ground level shot there. So what Griffith is doing here is, it seems very rudimentary to our 21st century minds right now, but at the time this was revolutionary. Okay, he's moving the camera. He is shooting one scene from different angles and different locations, and he's cutting all of these and putting them together to tell a coherent story. So no longer are we limited to one shot per scene. We can now have several shots per scene. When we watch this, it's obvious to us that these characters are in the same location, and that this character here, this character here, when he turns and gestures to come over, that he's talking to this woman here. And he does it again. Cuts to the woman. She seems to look over at him. Oops, I did it again. Oops. Now again, it's obvious to us that he is gesturing to her and she is responding or looking at him. But that thinking would not have been obvious. It was not obvious to filmmakers at the time. This was something that Griffith had essentially created for us. Okay, the ability to take two different pieces of film, put them together, and trust that the audience would understand that they're part of the same idea. Okay, it's like putting two words together to form a phrase and knowing that your listener is going to understand what that phrase means. All right. So how does this work? I mean, it's kind of a silly question, but there's an incredibly important psychological concept behind that. Now, let me just say this real quick. I said that editing is what kind of makes film unique as an art form. What I mean by that is film has a lot of elements that cross over into other art forms. Okay, there's theater, obviously, because it involves acting. It involves a kind of a play, right? Dialogue and so forth. It crosses over with literature because it both involves creative storytelling. It crosses over with photography because, of course, it relies on a lot of photographic principles in the cinematography. So there are a lot of different art forms that it also incorporates. But editing, we don't really find in any other medium except for film. But there is one medium that is kind of similar to film in that regard, and that would be comics. Okay. Comics also tell stories visually, and they do it primarily by putting different images together in a sequence. And it's that sequence of images that allows the story to move forward, allows us to understand how these ideas kind of cohere together to form a coherent story. Here is what we call a panel in the world of comics. A single panel in which we have one character who looks like he's wielding an axe very threateningly and menacingly at this character here in the foreground. All right, he's saying, "Now you die." Now this is a single image. I'm gonna add another panel. What happens? What if these two panels tell a story? What is the story that they tell? You're probably thinking, duh. This scream indicates that the axe murder was successful, and this poor guy in the foreground is now dying. That's the story that emerges when we put these two images together. Okay, so panel 1 plus panel 2 equals this. Okay, the guy in the foreground is now dead. Now, what's interesting here is that this panel does not show our character actually getting murdered with the axe. It's implied here, okay, but it's not literally shown. It's not literally depicted. If we're going to agree that this guy in the foreground is now dead, we are actually the ones who killed him. This happened in our minds, okay? And this is in comics. This principle is known as closure. Okay, closure. We can define it as the narrative coherence that's created by our mind's tendency to kind of fill in the gaps between images. Okay, and that gap would be right here. Okay, so as we move from this image here on the left to this image here on the right, our minds put them together. And this is because the mind wants, I don't know, we are driven to storytelling. We really like stories. We like things to make sense. Okay, so when we see these two images together, we want them to form a kind of coherent story. It pleases our minds. It makes us feel better to understand something, right? And so we put them together and we make sense of it. And in our minds, what that means is this guy is dead. Okay, but again, it's our minds doing it. Our minds closing those two images together and reaching a kind of understanding or new knowledge from it. Let's go back to D.W. Griffith's editing here. So we can see closure if we take this image here of the man looking behind him and gesturing, kind of waving, come here. We put that next to this image here of the woman who seems to kind of be looking. We've got the lead room here, looking this way. In our minds, we are making sense of this. We are creating the coherence. And the story that these two images are telling together is that the man is calling the woman over. Okay? That's closure, if we want to apply that term to cinema. By the way, this gap here, the moment when this shot transitions to this shot, that's the cut. Okay? And a cut can be defined simply as an abrupt transition between shots. Okay? There's no dissolve, there's no fade, there's nothing, no special kind of transition. It's just, it goes immediately from one shot to the next. That's it. That's what a cut is. Okay? This term obviously comes from the early technology of editing, which would involve literally cutting and splicing the celluloid film together. Okay. Let's take a look at some examples of closure in more modern films. Now, this is a really neat scene from the movie No Country for Old Men, and I don't want to give too much into the backstory here, but this character here that we see in the thumbnail, he is a chicken farmer. He's not a main character, and he's going to have a very unfortunate encounter with one of our main characters, the villain of the story.
What's the problem there, neighbor? Yep, that'll suck some power. Over time.
You from around here?
Yeah, Alpine, born and bred. Here you go.
What airport would you use?
It says, what airport would you use?
Airport or airstrip?
Airport.
Well, where you going?
I don't know.
Just lighting up for the territories, huh? Brother, I've been there. Well, there's airstrips. The airport is El Paso. If you want someplace specific, you might could be better off just driving to Dallas. Not have to connect. You gonna clamp him, buddy?
Can you get those chicken grates out of the bed?
What are you talking about?
So he asks him, "Are you gonna? Can you get those chicken crates out of the bed?" So this chicken farmer pulls up to our villain, doesn't know he's the villain, and just thinks he needs some car help, and is very kind, very generous, trying to help him jumpstart his car, and then the villain asks him, "Can you get those chicken crates out of the back?" And he says, "What are you talking about?" And then the film cuts, just quickly cuts to this shot of our villain cleaning out the chicken feathers from the bed of the farmer's car. So what we're supposed to deduce from this is that our villain has killed the chicken farmer and taken his car. If you watch this movie, then that moment of closure will happen for you very instantaneously, because you know our villain, you know what he's capable of. You've seen him in situations like this before. Okay, but the point here is that our editor did not, or the filmmakers did not feel like it's necessary to show him killing the chicken farmer. They're going to trust the audience to put those two shots together and figure that out for themselves. Okay. Here's another example of closure that's much simpler and also much more subtle. Okay, we've seen this one before when we were talking about establishing shots. This scene opens with an establishing shot as the camera kind of tilts and pans at the same time upwards, points at the apartment building that our character is now entering. Okay, and that was it. That was the moment of closure. Okay, when the scene cuts from the establishing shot outside the apartment building to this long shot here inside the apartment building, the moment of closure in our minds is that we are inside that building. Okay? We didn't need any characters to tell us I'm entering this building, or any other clue that we were moving into the building. Shot outside the building, shot inside the building, in our minds makes sense. That's the building that we're entering. Here's another example of closure from the film Psycho. And I'm not going to give too much away about the film, tell you where this takes place, but we have a character here who seems to be very cautious in approaching this house. What's the closure here? Well, it's happening in these instances when the film cuts between the shot of our character looking to the shot of the house. So in our minds, what do we assume as the film cuts back and forth between these two shots? I'm waiting for an answer. It's not a trick question. It might seem, in fact, it's so obvious that it's right there in front of you. You're probably not even realizing it. The closure is she's approaching the house. Okay, she's approaching the house, but we don't. What some people might do is take an extreme long shot to show her and the house in the same frame, and show her slowly approaching it, right? But that's not what this film is doing. It's cutting back and forth, a shot of her without the house in the frame, and then a shot of the house without her in the frame. But you put those two together, and you keep getting closer to each one. Then what the closure is telling us here is that she is approaching the house and getting closer to the house. Okay. Now, closure is a term that I'm kind of borrowing from the world of comics and graphic novels. It's not really a term that we tend to use in film studies. But there is a term in the world of film that means kind of the same thing as closure, and that term is the Kuleshov effect. The Kuleshov effect comes from the name itself. Kuleshov is actually the last name of the filmmaker Lev Kuleshov. He was a member of a Soviet-Russian film school in the very early 20th century. Okay, now at this time, Russia was Soviet, and any kind of any films that were being made were going to be propaganda films. All right, but Lev Kuleshov conducted an experiment. And it was an experiment having to do with film editing. And what he did was he took a shot of this man right here, kind of a close-up shot of this man right here, whose facial expression is very inscrutable. Okay, doesn't really have much of an expression, kind of a blank expression. And what he did is he cut back and forth between the shot of this man's face and then another object. Okay, and then what they would ask the audience to do afterwards is explain what they thought the man was feeling. Okay, whoops. I'll show you this here. So a shot of a bowl of soup, followed by the shot of the man's face. Shot of a child in a coffin. Shot of the same man's face. Now, same facial expression each time. And then finally, a shot of a woman lying, well, at the time, seductively on a couch. Shot of the man's face. Okay? So again, soup, man's face, child in a coffin, man's face, woman in a seductive pose, man's face. So they would ask the audience after each of these cuts, they would ask the audience, what is the man feeling? And when they showed the soup and the man's face, they said, well, the man's hungry. Okay. Then when they saw the man's face after the child in the coffin, they said, oh, the man's sad, he's mourning. And then, of course, it changed when they saw the man's face after the woman lying on the couch, saying, "Oh, he's feeling a bit turned on, a bit aroused." And so it didn't matter. It didn't matter that the man's face, his expression never changed. What they were doing was essentially combining those two images into a coherent story. Okay? And that's known as the Kuleshov effect. That when the audience sees two images, next to each other like that, juxtaposed, these two shots juxtaposed, they're going to put them together in a way that kind of makes sense. Now here's Alfred Hitchcock, the famous director Alfred Hitchcock, who's essentially describing the Kuleshov effect, and he kind of does his own Kuleshov experiment in this one.
What one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees. And he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man.
He's a kindly man.
He's sympathetic. Now,
woman and a baby,
take the
man looking at them and smiling.
With the child. But leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man.
What is he now? He's a dirty old
No
man, he
longer
says.
the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's what film can do for you.
So all he did was change the shot of the thing that of the man is looking at. Okay? So the shot of him, his face, it doesn't change. He's using the same film stock, the same footage, but just replacing the other shot, the shot of the woman with the baby, with the shot of the woman in the bikini. Okay? And so what he's describing here is essentially the Kuleshov effect, or in comics, closure. Okay? The meaning that we make out of that smile is all in our minds, and it comes out of the combination of those two shots. All right, let's take a look here at how Hitchcock uses or relies on that Kuleshov effect in this scene from his very famous film Psycho. Okay, so this is towards the beginning.
Aren't you going to take the pills? They'll knock that headache out.
This is our main character
buy
right
off
now. Her name
unhappiness
is
with
Marion
pills.
Crane. She works
I guess I'll
as
go
a
put this money in the bank
secretary
and go home and sleep it off.
for a commercial real estate company, and she's just been given an envelope full of $40,000 in cash that she's supposed to take to the bank. And this is on a Friday, so she's supposed to do it before the weekend. But instead, she takes it home. Now, she doesn't mean to steal it. She just she figures she'll drop it off later. But she brings it home, puts it on the bed. Okay. Now watch how this scene unfolds. it's going to cut back and forth between Marion, our character here, who's looking at her suitcase and looking at the money, and then it'll cut back and forth between shots of her looking, shots of the money, shots of her looking kind of concerned, and the money again. And what she's doing here, by the way, she's packing to go visit her boyfriend, who lives the next state over. And this trip was planned. Looking at the money again. I'm gonna go ahead and pause it here. So what's happening here? This is a completely wordless scene. Nobody's talking. There's no voiceover narration. But Hitchcock is communicating a lot of information to us simply through the combination of shots. Okay? What's happening here is that our character, Marion, is thinking about running away with this $40,000 that doesn't belong to her. Okay? And how do we know that? Well, it's again in the combination of the shots. Okay? We get a lot of shots of Marion herself, who has a kind of concerned or pained expression on her face. But that shot itself wouldn't be enough to tell us this story. What we need is at least this shot here, which is the money, the thing that she's looking at. Okay, and the way that the film kind of keeps cutting back and forth and getting closer and closer up on the money, it's as if the money is occupying her mind. Okay? Now that's also it's also dependent upon this shot here of the suitcase. Okay, so there's kind of like three pieces of information that are combined in this scene to form a coherent story for us. Okay, a woman is thinking about stealing money and running away. All right. That's why, by the way, we sometimes call editing the syntax of film. All right. If this is the sentence that this scene is conveying, the reason why we can understand what the scene is communicating to us is because of the way that those bits and pieces of the scene are put together. These are the words: woman, money, suitcase. We put them together, and then we have this coherent sentence there.